What are the three key questions facing the New York Jets for fantasy football in 2023? It's time to break it down right here and right now as we begin another edition of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL and fantasy football for sportingnews.com. It is time to break down Aaron Rodgers' new team. The New York Jets are in the spotlight with our key questions. That knocks out another division. The AFC East comes to its conclusion. So if you missed any of the breakdowns of the key questions for all the NFC teams, 16 or the previous teams from this division, check it out on our archives. But we move forward with the Jets. On deck will be the AFC North team. So we'll look at the Ravens and Bengals up next. So breaking out all 32 teams before they head into training camp here for you. Aaron Rodgers makes the Jets a lot more interesting here for sure in 2023. So we'll try to answer the three key questions we have about their offense, and knowing that they should be a lot more productive and be a better team overall. So that's great news. Another team with fantasy football viability that we didn't quite have at this level last year. And we'll check in on those two dynamic second-year players as well, Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We're free and available to you wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and follow for free. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your fantasy football team every day as well. All right, let's dive right into the JETS Jets. The first question we have is Aaron Rodgers headed to a big bounce back as a QB1 as he's changed from Green Bay to New York? Let's first examine where Aaron Rodgers was last year in his final season with the Packers. He finished as QB 13 overall. QB 23, however, big difference when you look at the average points per game, so not a lot there. And you look at where the Jets were last year, believe it or not, you had Mike White. He was the best of the Jets quarterbacks for a short period of time. He was the average QB 21. So Mike White in his short stint averaged more fantasy football points than Aaron Rodgers with the Packers. So go figure that. Now, where does Aaron Rodgers rank for this year in his first year of the Jets? QB 15, according to the expert consensus on Fantasy Pros. Let's look at his numbers from last year. 3,695 yards, 26 TDs, 12 interceptions, only 94 rushing yards, pretty low for him, and only one rushing TD. So there wasn't a lot there to supplement the mistakes that he usually doesn't make and not getting to 4,000 yards. So really it was a bit of a disaster here without Nathaniel Hackett, who went to Denver, and it didn't work out well for Russell Wilson. So it was just not a good way for Aaron Rodgers to end his Packers career overall. And we knew that part of it was not having Devontae Adams transitioning with a new wide receiver core. Now let's look at what the Jets put up last year in a different type of offense with Mike LaFleur, Matt's brother, who's the Packers coach. 4,040 yards passing. So they did get to 4,000 yards. They did pass quite a bit, 63% of the time last year, because they were trailing a lot in a lot of games because of their offense, not because of their defense. 15 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. That's not great. Only 6.4 yards per attempt. That's pretty bad. They did, as a team, however, rack up 171 rushing yards, much of that being Zach Wilson, and 2 TDs. So looking at the numbers, they weren't bad. Again, Mike White finished well into the QB2s, but still more viable than you would think. There, you had their top receiver, Garrett Wilson, the rookie out of Ohio State, only had 4 of those 15 TDs. So there was just not a lot to go around. And you look at Nathaniel Hackett coming from throwing a good 58% of the time in Denver. So you expect they might throw less, hopefully with the Jets winning some games there with Hackett and Robert Saleh. But that also means there's room for improvement with less volume. How does that work? Well, look at the YPA, 6.4, 5.9 when you do the adjusted yards per attempt. So that was terrible. We know Aaron Rodgers, even at his worst, can get to 7. and that's a very good number, and I think he can push to 7.5 in this particular passing game. Now, also let's look at Aaron Rodgers' numbers with Nathaniel Hackett as the main guy with LaFleur in Green Bay. QB 10, that was great when he started on his MVP run. QB 3 and QB 6, those were his 3 finishes. Last 2 years, he finished as the MVP at QB 3 and QB 6 in fantasy football there in those years before Hackett left in 2022 to take over as the Broncos head coach. So the numbers have been particularly amazing when you put Rodgers with Hackett for fantasy and reality. So that's why the Jets immediately went after Hackett to replace LaFleur, brought in Rodgers, made a lot of sense working under Robert Saleh. So it's an offense he knows well. It didn't matter that he got into the mix late. He knows it better than any of these Jets that are there. So that's an advantage. He still has plenty left in the tank. I think he also is helped by having a few familiar faces around. Alan Lazard comes over in a free agent deal, so he works in. They move Elijah Moore. And you also have Randall Cobb in the mix here for Rodgers. So pretty decent group of receivers when you add the depth from last year. You have guys that can get in the red zone and make things happen. After Wilson, you had Tyler Conklin and Corey Davis. They were red zone targets here. Now you had Al Lazard, who was a big touchdown scorer for the Packers last year. So he comes over. So plenty of ways to get the ball in the end zone. You had CJ Uzama there out of tight end. He was pretty good, we know, a couple years ago with Joe Burrow. You get Conklin, Uzama. You have Davis there in the mix with Lazard, Wilson, Cobb. A lot of weapons to display here to put the ball in the end zone. So the touchdowns can definitely bump up to 30. There's the potential, again, to get to the 4,000-yard mark. Those interceptions should go down. And you figure the rushing has to go up. That's a pretty low number here overall. So I think Aaron Rodgers can do more with less. Again, these quarterbacks were so ineffective pushing the ball downfield. I think it was total disaster. It was Rodgers and Hackett separated, not putting up the good numbers. We know that Russell Wilson really struggled, put those numbers up there with Hackett. So I think reunited and it feels so good. That's what you're going to get here with Rodgers and Hackett. It's going to be very similar to what we saw with the Packers. So, look, I'm not going to go bang the table and say he should be ranked higher than QB 15 all that much more. There are a lot of qualified candidates that you can look at, but I think he's being a bit undervalued here at QB 15. I think there are some guys that would look at less there in the range. I mean, you look at that group that we talked about, Kirk Cousins and Jared Goff, those type of pocket passers. Well, Rodgers gives you a bit of running upside. He's got the weapons, and he's got a better track record finishing in the top 12. So I think if you can get Rodgers as your QB1 a little bit later, take that value and take it to full advantage here because I think it's going to pay off. So everything lines up well here for Rodgers to have a bounce-back season. He wants to be with the Jets. He was kind of playing lame duck with the Packers. I know it's a new set of receivers again, but there's a few familiar faces, and especially the offensive coordinator who's going to help him with this transition big time and put up those numbers. So Rodgers, again, enjoy the value while you can as a QB 15. I think you'll creep into more of that back-end top 12 QB1 territory there as we get closer to fantasy football actual draft time. So there you have a look at Aaron Rodgers and what could be happening with him and the Jets in his first full season in New York. We'll ask that key question about Breece Hall coming off that torn ACL, that major knee injury from last year after a very promising rookie year. And then Garrett Wilson, another special rookie. So a lot of great rookies, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Ahmad Sauce Gardner on this team that are going into year 2. So very exciting team to break down the New York Jets on today's show. It is an exciting time of year as well in MLB as we get to the All-Star break. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. That's a lot of fun. Now we've got the Home Run Derby as well as part of the MLB All-Star Weekend, and we know home runs have been flying out of the park all season long. So that's a good thing to get in on, as well as the game result action. It's all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly on FanDuel. That's the best place to bet. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball and a proud sponsor here of the Locked On Network. All right, it is time to continue the show and continue to break down the New York Jets here. And we'll ask the second key question. What do we expect from Breece Hall, and when is he going to be healthy and back on the field here in year 2? What a big year that Breece Hall was almost having last year. Let's look at it. He finished as RB42 overall, but didn't get a lot of work early. But look at the explosion. The average points per game and half-point PPR, RB7. That's how he was performing. That's where he was headed in scoring, in the top end RB1 and top 12 range. He had 681 yards from scrimmage, 5 TDs. And now you look at where he could go. If he's fully healthy over season, you're looking at 250 touches, 1,200 yards to 1,300 yards from scrimmage, 12 to 13 touchdowns. When you look at the Jets from last year, not a lot in the backfield that is gone. You have 59 carries, 73 touches overall. Those guys were Ty Johnson and James Robinson. That's basically who is vacating those targets. Right now, behind him, in order the depth chart reads, Michael Carter. We know him as a change of pace back. Izzy Abanikanda. They got him out of Pitt in the draft. And Zonovan Knight, who flashed a little bit last year when Hall was on the shelf with that knee injury. So he was out. Keep in mind, week 7 last year, so there was not a lot. That's what you can expect him to be at full speed. Now, I still think he'll get on the field, decent chance to play there in week 1 with his recovery. Look, they've been pretty optimistic all offseason long that it hasn't been having any setbacks. Hall's on track to play. Again, midseason allows you that opportunity to play early. I don't think you'll see him hit his full speed and full capacity of playing at a high level, however, until that year-long mark passes where you get to the week 6, week 7. That's where I think you'll see Breece Hall at full speed. But that doesn't mean the Jets won't be careful and start to use him early. It's not like they invested a lot, right? They haven't gone after Dalvin Cook yet, so that would be a red flag that, hey, Breece Hall may not be ready, and we've got to have a back of that caliber to replace him. They moved on from Robinson, didn't bring back Johnson. Abanikanda was a nice value pick, but Knight quickly buried at number 3. And Michael Carter, he was replaced by Hall last year. So all these things are saying that the Jets are not too worried about Breece Hall's availability, at least early. Now, in terms of fantasy football, when is he going to push up to that ceiling and the production from last year? It might be a little bit of a slow start, but look, we're looking at him as being an RB2 right now with upside, and that's what we want to look at, right? We're not being too greedy with his number here. Right now, you look at Breece Hall, I mean, he's right up there with the top running backs, but you have him as RB11. That's pretty conservative, but in half-point PPR, that's about where you're going to look at him, in the back end of the RB1s, really. So it's really not dropping him too much, right? He finished as RB7. When you look at the average points per game, he's ranked right inside the top 12. So there's a lot of confidence, not only with the Jets, but the fantasy football industry, with the health and all that he's on track to be fully healthy, and which is great news here. I don't know if that's the same feeling with Javonte Williams. Of course, his injury was much later in the season, lost a few more weeks there late. So I really look at that possibility of Breece Hall coming back at full strength being very special here. So don't worry too much about Breece Hall. I think he'll be fine. Again, you might see the slow numbers early. Don't panic about that. He's also a guy, if someone in your league is kind of giving up on him early and might come out of the gate slowly, that he can really explode there after that 6 week. And I think Breece Hall, again, you can get him at a value that you wouldn't have had if he was fully healthy. I mean, it's still not a great value because he's RB11, but I think you would have to pay kind of RB5, RB6 prices to draft him. Now you can draft him a little later and feel good about that. There's nothing to be allergic to with Breece Hall. I'll just say that here with his value. I think he's there. All signs point to him being ready and being his explosive self sooner rather than later during the season. I really like him overall, his pass catching ability. And keep in mind, Nathaniel Hackett, I think that's a good influence, right? You have the combination of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon from Green Bay. I think there are some qualities that Hall has both of these back, so that's good. We know the numbers that Aaron Jones consistently puts up in the offense of Green Bay, and we saw Javonte Williams, speaking of Javonte Williams, work well when he was healthy with Hackett last year. So all these things line up really well. So Breece Hall, no worries about him. Rodgers feeling good about him. Do we feel the same about Garrett Wilson? We'll get into that in our last segment here, Locked On Fantasy Football. Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Today, every dayers. Tomorrow, we will break down the Baltimore Ravens. Changes abound there. We have another 8 quarterback there. Yes, Aaron Rodgers switching from 12 to 8, going to the Jets. We know Lamar Jackson already wears that number. So a lot of excitement over Lamar and this new offense with Todd Monken. So we'll get into that tomorrow there as one of the key questions we'll ask about the 2023 Baltimore Ravens. And we'll close the week looking at the Cincinnati Bengals, check in on them and Joe Burrow and Joe Mixon. So a lot of good stuff still coming where we'll get to all 32 teams. We're deep into the AFC here before training camp begins all across the league. All right, it is time to close the show with a look at one more key question for the 2023 New York Jets. Garrett Wilson, do we believe the hype as him as a wide receiver 1? First, let's see where the rookie receiver finished in 2022. Wide receiver 19 in terms of overall scoring and half-point PPR, so that put him right in the back end of the wide receiver 2s. Wide receiver 31, so he actually finished as a wide receiver 3 when looking at the average points per game. We know his role wasn't as significant earlier in the season, and it kind of built from there. Look at the numbers overall: 147 targets, caught 83, 1,103 yards, and 4 TDs. Now, if you look at how he could ascend to wide receiver 10, this is interesting. Devonta Smith was the wide receiver 10 in half-point PPR last year, 95 catches, so only 12 more receptions than Wilson, 136 targets, so he actually had 11 fewer targets. He got up to 1,200 yards, essentially, just short of that number, and 7 TDs. So that is very attainable for Wilson in those numbers. So I think that's a modest approach, right? That might be a floor play here with Garrett Wilson. And it's interesting to see where the other receivers are ranked that are on the Jets. The next guy is Allen Lazard. He's at wide receiver 52. You have the main key targets that are vacated from last year are Elijah Moore, traded to the Browns, and Braxton Berrios. They combined for 78 catches, 591 yards, and a TD on their 97 targets. So those targets are available, but we have Allen Lazard. You got Mecole Hardman in the mix. You got Randall Cobb. You got a bunch of young receivers still. Denzel Mims hanging on still on this roster. And don't forget about Tyler Conklin, as well as CJ Uzomah at tight end. So they have ways to spread around those targets. So I wouldn't expect getting too deeper there. I think it's more the efficiency and production. Again, we said the yards per attempt being better for Rodgers, the air yards, converting those into better opportunities. So really, with the same opportunities as we saw with Devonta Smith, he can put up those wide receiver 10 numbers, Garrett Wilson. So when you look at that, yeah, that is special. So can he get to 90 catches? I think 90 is fair. I think getting to triple digits receptions is in the works here. He could be the new Devontae Adams. Again, he would have been right there scoring more touchdowns. The Jets scored more touchdowns. They only had 15 touchdown passes. Again, if they bumped that to 30, you think they could get 8 scores out of Wilson in that range. And when you look at his yardage, I think you feel confident that he can bump up over 1,200 because he's a big play target and he's lining up all over the field, right? They don't really have a dedicated slot here with Moore and Berrios gone. I know Cobb can play there, but Corey Davis is an outside guy. Allen Lazard can be a big slot, but he's more of an outside guy as well. So Garrett Wilson has some route versatility, playing off these bigger receivers as well to help him. And then you got the speedsters, Hardman. Cobb still has a few steps here. So everything lines up well for Garrett Wilson. There's just enough help to deflect the target attention away from him in terms of double teams and all that. He's got an elite quarterback now, going from the mess of Mike White and Zach Wilson and the others, Joe Flacco, to having a legit quarterback raising his game. So the connection should be better. Downfield, stretching the field, all that good stuff here. So, yeah, wide receiver 10, I think, is a conservative estimate here for Garrett Wilson, given his dominant number 1 role and everything dropping off here. So, again, when you have that, it's not the situation where we look at with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, who was the actual wide receiver 10 from last year, where, okay, there's an equal other receiver on the other side, but there's enough mouths to feed through Rodgers' craftiness, through Rodgers' history of really making a number 1 act like a number 1 in reality and fantasy, that you feel great about that. So Garrett Wilson, we're banging the table, go after him pretty high as a wide receiver 1. Breece Hall, feel comfortable as a RB1, and Aaron Rodgers, sleeper that you're looking at as a QB1. So all good vibes with the Jets. Everything is great. They're going after this playoff berth here with Robert Saleh. So it should be a very fruitful season. And you could see a lot of parallels here. I'm going to give you one that you look at. Tom Brady, coming over to the Buccaneers, having that effect on the rest of the offense, and Tom Brady himself putting up those numbers. So it could rejuvenate Rodgers, help all these young targets really play well. It's a very good team, so that means scoring, putting some teams away, all that kind of good stuff. The defense can turn it over back to the offense. So a lot of things lining up for this offense to live up to its potential, as Hackett and Rodgers are the centerpiece of this, but Hall and Wilson are the key components here in the skill positions to really make this offense hum, as well as that offensive line working out a little bit better with better health up front. So there you have a look at the New York Jets and the three key questions: Aaron Rodgers, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson. We'll come back tomorrow, look at Lamar Jackson, J.K. Dobbins, Rashad Bateman versus Odell Beckham Jr. So that means the Baltimore Ravens are our team of the day for our next show as we transition from the AFC East to the AFC North. Subscribe and follow for free with Locked On Fantasy Football wherever you get your podcasts. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your fantasy football team every day. For Locked On Fantasy Football, this has been Vinnie Iyer. See you next time with a look at the Ravens.